Okay, great. Thank you, Naomi. Okay, this is Aviva Orlian. Thank you for being with us. Mrs. Aviva Orlian teaches a weekly Tanakh class to women in Monsey, New York, and has been lecturing for various community-wide women's programs for over 20 years. Most recently, she has been featured presenter for varied programming for the OU's Women's Initiative. Aside from her love of teaching, Mrs. Orlian is a practicing speech-language pathologist. She earned her undergraduate degree from Towson State University and her graduate degree from Brooklyn College. A selection of her lectures and essays can be found on Torah Anytime, YU Torah, and OU.org. Mrs. Orlian lives in Monsey with her husband and children. Thank you, Mrs. Orlian, for joining us. We are looking forward to hearing you.
Hi, thank you so much. First of all, that was extremely inspiring. I can start work being very, very inspired. I'm actually running off to work as soon as we finish here. But what an inspirational group you are. Oh my goodness, Nishmat, the Tehillim. I mean, I think we can stop now. I mean, what am I going to offer after this? Wow. Really incredible. So, I can't say nice to see everybody because I see a lot of names here, Black names. If any of you would like to put on your screen so I can see people, that would be nice, but you don't have to, no pressure. But anyway, who doesn't like a story? You know, who doesn't like the story of Megillas Rus? It's a story of connection. It's a story of fortunes changing. It's a story of the bringing about the potential of Mashiach. And to top it all off, what a great shidduch story it is. There are several reasons that we read about Rus on Shavuos, and one of them is obviously because she experienced her personal Mamad Har Sinai. She said Nase v'nishma in her personal and private way. She embodied so many of the characteristics that are models for all of us in terms of what are the key ingredients necessary for being Mekabel Ol Malchus Shamayim and maintaining that inspiration. When we think of Mamad Har Sinai, there's a public display and a public acceptance. There's fire, there's lightning, there's thunder, there's clouds. Hashem's voice spoke to all of Klal Yisrael that it was too much for Klal Yisrael to handle all of the Aseret HaDibros. Rus also had her journey, her own Mamad Har Sinai, but it was a quiet and personal affair. It was Rus hearing the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu echo throughout the generations. Hashem's voice not thundering out, but whispering kaviyachol in her ear in a kol demamadaka, in a soft voice. Rus, in her unassuming manner, is moved to be Makabel Ol Malchus Shamayim. What inspired her? We don't know exactly, but we can hazard a guess, perhaps by watching and absorbing the mode of conduct of her mother-in-law, Naomi. To go back to the public Mamad Har Sinai and Makabel Ol Malchus Shamayim in general, the Or HaChaim teaches us something fundamental about Kabbalas HaTorah, about factors that are integral. They are integral ingredients in the acquisition of Torah. And he leads us to psukim in the Torah that describe the public giving of the Torah at Har Sinai. And he gives us the following lessons. That there are several ingredients that are evident in the mode, and those lessons and those ingredients that are necessary to be Makabel Ol Malchus Shamayim, which are hinted to in the Torah, which we'll speak to in a moment. Those ingredients are clearly evident in the mode of behavior of Rus, as well as the other personalities in Megillas Rus. What the Or HaChaim outlines for us, for our ability to be Makabel Ol Malchus Shamayim, we see these ingredients within the personalities that are presented in Sefer Rus. The pasuk in Yisro tells us, Vayis'u me'Refidim, vayavo midbar Sinai, vayachanu b'midbar, vayichan sham Yisrael neged hahar. Bnei Yisrael, before Mamad Har Sinai, they traveled from Refidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai, and they camped in the Midbar. Vayichan sham Yisrael neged hahar, and Klal Yisrael camped opposite the mountain. And within this pasuk, there are references, says the Or HaChaim, to three fundamental requirements for Kabbalas HaTorah. Their point of departure, says the Or HaChaim, was Refidim, Vayis'u me'Refidim, which can be a play on words and is an allusion to the idea of weakness. Refidim from the lashon of Rifayon Yadayim, a weakness, meaning they left Refidim, they left from a psychological place of weakness. meaning that to truly take on the yoke of Torah, we have to strengthen ourselves because it demands some sort of Mesiras Nefesh. Living a Torah lifestyle requires some submission. It requires self-sacrifice. And if we are to use the illusion of marriage, which Kabbalas Torah really was, it was the marriage between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael, the image that Chazal paints for us, in fact, Kafa Aleim Har Kigigas, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took Har Sinai, turned it over like a barrel over Bnei Yisrael, that's an illusion, really, of a chuppah. That's one way to look at it. It's the marriage between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. So if we continue with this metaphor, then marriage, just as Kabbalas Torah, also requires some sort of sacrifice and submission to the will of the other at times. If we were to walk into marriage with the expectation of he's giving to me, or what do I want and what do I need, and I need to be served versus what I can contribute, the marriage really is doomed to be rocky. Marriage is about what each one thinks that they can contribute to the other. It's when the I is removed from the equation. It's resisting the temptation to be self-centered. And the same holds true with Bnei Yisrael and our marriage, so to speak, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu via the Torah. In Devarim, Moshe, before he leaves, before Moshe departs from Bnei Israel and before he dies and Bnei Israel on the cusp of entering the land, Moshe tells Bnei Israel that he is standing between Bnei Israel and Hashem. The lashon that is used is Anochi Omeid Bein Hashem Ubeinechem. I am standing, says Moshe, between you and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm the go-between. But another way of understanding this, says the Baal Shem Tov, is that Anochi, not Moshe, but the Anochi, the I, the Anochius, the self-centeredness, that is what is standing between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. Anochi, the Anochi is standing between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. The focus on self and looking at what I need versus looking outward to what I can do for God, that attitude gets in the way of forging a connection with Hashem. In other words, it's a lack of Mesiras Nefesh. Can we refrain from speaking that Lashon Hara? It's just too juicy. Can we get up a few minutes early to daven more appropriately? Can I spend a few more moments of my time on the phone with somebody who is in need, even though I'm being driven crazy? Driving all those carpools, ensuring a proper chinuch for our children at tremendous cost. These are the everyday acts of self-sacrifice and Mesiras Nefesh that we do for Torah. There are small acts of sacrifice, and then, of course, there are monumental acts of sacrifices that we know all too well our people have engaged in throughout our history. And the Gemara in Brachos tells us, "Minayin she'ein divrei Torah miskaimin ela b'mi shememis atzmo aleha." We see that there is the idea that a person can really acquire Torah for himself and internalize it when he is ready to kill himself, but he is ready to die for the sake of Torah. Shne'amar zos Torahs adam ki yamus ba'ohel. This is the law of a man who dies in a tent. Now that pasuk is really referring shot level to Tuma and Tara, but the Chachamim look at this and says a man for Torah, because of the Torah, a man is willing to literally put himself in danger for the Torah, up to a point, obviously. But a person is willing to give up his life to be Moser Nefesh for Torah. Torah should be something that we should be ready to go to our deaths defending at some points. And at some points in our history, that indeed was the case. But says the Nesiva Shalom, ironically, if we were asked, if God forbid we were faced with a situation and given the choice to die al Kiddush Hashem, or God forbid renounce our religion, wouldn't we just say, yes, there's no question I would do it? We would jump to our deaths without thinking, right? Ironically, says the Nesiva Shalom, would we be willing to die? We'd be willing to die al Kiddush Hashem, theoretically, right? If somebody put a gun to our head and said, eat this, serve avodah zarah, or kill somebody, what would we do? We would say, no, we're going to die al Kiddush Hashem. So many of us, says the Nesiva Shalom, we'd say, yes, we would die al Kiddush Hashem. But he says, listen to what the Chazal say. She'ein divrei Torah miskaimin ela b'mi shememis atzmo aleha. Would we be able to sacrifice atzmo, our atzmius, atzmecha, meaning are we too self-centered to give a little bit of ourselves for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so that something that goes beyond our comfort level, the atzmius. We're not talking about grand acts of Mesiras Nefesh, of jumping into a fire. He's talking about small acts of self-sacrifice that go beyond our comfort level. Can we be mevater? Can we be too self-centered to give a little bit of our time to help another one beyond our comfort level? Can we be mevater and give up on having that simcha hall all to ourselves for a kiddush and share it with another bal simcha? Can we keep quiet and restrain from having the last word? This is the atzmius, says the Nesiva Shalom. Being mekabel the Torah and renewing that commitment involves reducing our self-centeredness. The next characteristic that the Or HaChaim teaches us is that we learn from the previous pasuk, from the lashon of Vayachanu Bamidbar. Bnei Israel camped in the Midbar before receiving the Torah. They camped in the desert, implying desolation and humility. So this is what the Or HaChaim says: Ve'inyan beis hu hashiflus v'hanava ki ein divrei Torah miskaimin ela b'misha mashpil atzmo umesim atzmo kamidbar. Torah can be acquired and it can be ours if we are humble. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not like haughty people. In fact, the Torah is compared to water. Why? Because it flows from a high place to a low place. Someone who is full of himself and his own greatness has not really been Kona Torah. So of course, we see an overlap between the first characteristic and the second, all relating to the sense of self. The third characteristic that the Or HaChaim enumerates for us is alluded to in the words of Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar, and that we know very well, that this is referring to Achdus, to unity amongst Bnei Israel, which is so necessary for the Torah to make its full impact. The Kli Yakar adds another dimension, however, that the Torah is telling us, Vayis'u me Refidim, Bnei Israel left from Refidim, meaning a point of weakness. It implies that they traveled from a place of weakness as characterized by machlokas, by divisiveness. They reached the mountain and then Vayichan, they were united. The lashon of Vayichan is lashon yachid, of course, and it's talking about all of Klal Yisrael, meaning that they were like ish echad b'lev echad. Machlokas is inferred from Vayis'u me Refidim. They left weakness. They left that place of machlokas. Why is machlokas compared to weakness and Refidim? Because when there is tension among people, it only weakens the people. Deep fissures begin to crack at the foundation, and it is a danger to the entire structure of Klal Yisrael. So we have humility, Mesiras Nefesh, and Achdus, unity. They are also integral in allowing the Torah to fully penetrate into our lives. And all of these have one common thread, and that is the ability to negate self and shift our focus from our needs to what I can give and provide to others, and by extension, Hashem. So now let's turn our attention to the personal Mamad Har Sinai of Rus. And we see that all of the three personalities in Megillas Rus, Naomi, Boaz, exemplify these characteristics. Rus most certainly is an individual who embodies the strength and sacrifice for Torah, for her newfound religion. She is determined, she's relentless, and she no doubt has her role model from Naomi. What is incredible about Rus is that her desire to take on Yahadus, to take on the new religion, stemmed from her desire to help. It was a direct result of looking at Naomi, what can I do to help you? And that led her to take on the Torah. It's a direct result of her chesed. It came before. She takes on the Torah and the religion of Naomi. She wanted to follow Naomi and give to her and sustain her in her poverty, which in turn propelled her to take on the Torah. Her acceptance of the Torah was very much connected to her admiration of Naomi and what she represented. It was always about emulating her. As she says, Elokayach Elokai, kasher telechi elech, kasher talini alim. I want to do everything that you are doing because you are my model. You represent something incredible. And that is what drew her. And in turn, her ability to give and bestow chesed, that's what drew her to be able to accept the Torah. And what of Naomi? Naomi shows great strength. She certainly, Vayis'u me Refidim, she left from a place of weakness because she demonstrated great strength and determination to do an about face and confront the very townspeople that she abandoned years earlier. She leaves Beis Lechem because her family does not sustain her generation. She certainly did not initiate the idea, but she follows Elimelech, who abandoned his people. She becomes impoverished and has a Moabite daughter-in-law in tow, and yet she has the resolve to face her people, and she has the strength and the fortitude to own up to her mistake. She says when she meets the townspeople and she returns, she says, Al tikrena li Naomi, krena li Mara ki he mar shakai li ma'od. Don't call me Naomi, call me bitter, Mara, because Hashem has dealt bitterly to me and I deserve it. Ani meleyah halachti v'rekam hashivani Hashem. I came with everything, and Hashem has paid me back for what I have done. She owns up to her mistake. She left from the point of Rifei Adayim, of Rifayon, of Refidim, from the mindset that Refidim exemplifies. She actually left Moab. She left that horrible place, but she has the strong inner strength. She has conviction. Boaz, listen to his name, Boaz. In him is found strength. He is characterized by the Navi as an Ish Gibor Chayil in every sense of the word. The time period in which he, Naomi, and Rus lived was the period of the judges of the Shoftim, which was not a great time for Klal Yisrael. Ish hayashar be'einav ya'aseh. There was a cycle of people abandoning HaKadosh Baruch Hu, abandoning each other. There was machlokas, there was infighting, there was not a strong central leadership. Yet Boaz portrays his regard for the next man and tries to bring an awareness of the importance of each individual, even within his time period, which was characterized by machlokas. Now, we see this not just in how he conducts himself with Rus, but even before his interaction with her. Chazal hint to Boaz's character when we are first introduced to Boaz. He greets his field workers and he says to his field workers, Hashem imachem, Hashem should be with you. And Chazal tell us that he initiated something. He initiated a societal change within his generation. What was that change? That change was that he greeted his people with Hashem's name, and they in turn say, Yivarechacha Hashem, you should be blessed as well. This was an innovation that people began to greet each other by invoking Hashem's name. And Boaz instituted this. And the purpose was to heighten man's awareness that each individual is a Tselem Elokim. It brought a new awareness of the importance and the dignity of each person, because they are each a Tselem Elokim, Hashem imachem. And this was so crucial for the time period that was characterized by machlokas. He embodied Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Hahar by the small change that he instituted, which had a monumental impact on the people. While he was in this mindset of looking at every individual as important, this led naturally to his taking notice of Rus in his field, who the field workers encouraged Boaz to ignore and pay no attention to. She's a foreigner, she's a Moabite convert, we should have nothing to do with her. He acknowledges the kindness that she has done and she has done with her mother-in-law. Rus literally made herself into a midbar. She literally she divorced herself from her own needs, and she became united with her newfound people despite the cold reception that she has received. And Boaz displays sensitivity and a selfless attitude by first attending to Rus and then ultimately marrying her. Since Rus was a convert from the despised nation of Moab, whom the Torah warns us, Lo yavo Amoni uMoavi b'kal Hashem. We cannot marry any converts from the nation of Moab and Ammon. At this point, since Rus was a convert from this nation, at this point, no one knew the halacha that this halacha applies only to men and not to women, and that in fact women were permitted, female converts were permitted, because it was at this time period that Boaz publicized this heretofore unknown halacha. Until this point, men and women, female and male converts were not allowed to marry into the nation of Israel. And it was only during this story that the halacha became known. But do you know what it takes to change an accepted doctrine within society, to do something that was so radical, Boaz had the strength of character. He said, no, this is the halacha. It doesn't apply to men. It doesn't apply to women. It applies only to men. We are allowed to marry a convert from the nation of Moab. But it took boldness because it was an accepted doctrine and people questioned it. And yet Boaz had the strength. He had the resolve to buck the tide and do what was right, despite negative public opinion. He displayed by Yisume Refidim. He was not weak. And he had the strength of character. Rus as well is a model of self-sacrifice, making herself into a midbar, showing utter humility, showing utter self-sacrifice for the sake of Torah. She is determined to sustain Naomi and accompany her and stay with her new religion despite the cold reception that she has received. She puts aside any personal considerations, the atzmius, the anochi, leaving her homeland and status of royalty to accompany Naomi. She was reduced to accepting charity by gleaning in the fields with the other paupers, a princess falling from grace. Or did she really fall? She really elevated herself, but at that point, she fell from grace. You know how people will say, oh, she's too proud, she can't accept handouts, she's too proud. Naomi wasn't too proud. She did anything to stay within this religion, to stay and sustain her mother-in-law by acting like a pauper that she was. She truly was a person who embodied Naaseh v'nishma. Let me do and then I will hear. She accompanies Naomi, and only after does she accompany her does she hear the intricacies and the particulars of the religion. First she goes, then she listens to Naomi, as Chazal tell us on the way, she explained all the particulars of Yiddishkeit. It is on the way that Naomi teaches her the laws. She did Nasa v'nishma, her own personal Har Sinai. For Rus, she literally looked at the Torah as a choice between life and death. Life without Torah is a life not worth living in Rus's mind. She tells Naomi as such. Naomi tries to discourage her from returning back with her. Go back to your people. But what does she say? Vatomer Rus, al tifkei bi la'azvech l'shuv me'acharak. Don't hurt me. You are hurting me. You're giving me pain by pressuring me not to come with you. I need to come with you. And the Malbim explains, al tifkei bi lashon pegia inyan hariga, says the Malbim. Don't hurt me, meaning you're killing me. I will, it's as if I would be dead if I wouldn't take on the Torah. Sha'al yishdei sheta'azovos tamus misas hanefesh. My soul is going to depart from me. My soul is going to die. If I don't come with you and I don't accept your Torah, it's as if I am dead. She really embodies she'ein divrei Torah miskaimin ela b'mi shemei mis atzmo areha. For her, it was a choice, life with Torah or death. Rus leaves the comforts of her homeland and comes to Eretz Yisrael to meet an uncertain future. She exchanges luxury for poverty and isolation in exchange for being a princess on the highest social sphere, the highest societal strata. She thrusts herself into the lowest societal sphere for the sake of Torah. Rus initially, we have to understand, did not have any feelings of belonging. There was no achdus when it came to Rus. People looked at her. They were suspicious of her. They were upset with Naomi, clearly because she left her people. We know that at the end of the Megillah, they come full circle and there's a closure there, which that's another sheer in and of itself. But when she first arrives, the people look at Rus and Naomi, and what is their reaction? Vatehom kol ha'ir. They are aghast. They don't even know what to say, and they just utter the words, Hasos Naomi? Is this Naomi, the beautiful, magnificent, wealthy princess who left us? And look, she's reduced to rags, and here on her side is this Moabite woman. They look and they gawk, and they're incredulous at this transformation that she has made. And then they look at Rus with suspicion, this Moabite convert. And with all of this, it's important to know not one person offers them words of comfort or support. Not one of them offers them food or physical help. Was it perhaps payback for the people who were abandoned by Naomi so many years earlier? Not one of them offers them support. But despite all of this, Rus remains with her mother-in-law and her new religion and doesn't question. She could have said, is this the people that I want to be a part of? This is the people who are known as Baishanim Rahmanim Gomle Chasadim. Really? This is what I get for taking on this new religion? But they're not compassionate right now. Yet Rus questions nothing. She remains devoted, completely focused on Naomi and her religion. Which is really incredible when you think about it, because the feelings of belonging, of being connected to others, is probably one of the most potent needs that a human being has. We are social beings, and we have a need to connect to people. Rus did not have that connection at the beginning, and yet remained. In fact, when she meets Boaz on the field, we can see this very clearly. She's overcome with emotion because Boaz has attended to her and listened to her words. The Megillah tells us, "Vatipol al paneh," she falls on her face. "Vatishtachu arza," she bowed down, and she says to Boaz, "Why did I find favor in your eyes, lahakireni, to notice me, to take note of me as a human being? Va'anochi nachriya, I'm a foreigner." She's overcome with emotion because he takes notice of her. She feels somebody is paying attention to her. She's a human being. This is what impacts her. This gives her a sense of belonging. This was her vayis'u merafidim. It took strength and conviction to remain with this new people while being an outcast, but she did it. She stuck with it. Vayavo midbar Sinai. Bnei Israel came to the wilderness of Sinai. They came to the point where they understood that the Torah, we have to be like a midbar-like existence, giving up of ourselves for the next person. Rus accepted the Torah in her own midbar-like existence, where her life was initially desolate, with no hint at a future. She gives of herself to Naomi. Everything was about giving. Everything was about chesed. She took herself, the atzmius, out of the picture. Vayichan Sham Yisrael neged hahar. She displays unity with Am Yisrael and with her mother-in-law. She was united with her people, with her newfound people. And it's important to keep this in mind, that when we focus on others and look at the world as a way to bestow kindness to others, this is the training ground to give, quote unquote, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When we shift the focus away from ourselves, our path of giving to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that much easier. Rus's path to embracing Torah began with her path to give. It was her determination to give to somebody else. The Torah is called a Torah's chesed. Olam chesed yibaneh. The entire world is predicated on chesed. Why is she called Rus? Rus shera'asa b'divrei chamosa. She looked. She was sensitive. It's not just that she gave. She looked at the situation and she was perceptive to see, what do I have to give to my mother-in-law? She looked at the world as a way to give. And the truth is, the Megillah really is a story of giving, and it's a story of monumental impact, of bringing about the Zera Shel Mashiach, of bringing forth Mamlechas Beis David, and it was accomplished via small personal acts of chesed between people, between individuals. It's a very personal individual story that has incredible, monumental impact. May we all be zocheh to have the strength of character, to give of ourselves, to give up, anochias, to be able to give of ourselves, and by extension, to be a training ground to give to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. May we all be zocheh to see the sprouting of Mashiach b'mheira v'yameinu.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mrs. Orlian. Do you have a couple minutes for questions? I know you said you had to go to work.
I have a couple minutes, yeah. I have like 3-4 minutes.
Okay, fantastic. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. It was really beautiful. It was just so insightful.
Oh, I have a question.
Oh, okay, great. Go ahead, Alyssa.
So from what you're saying, I guess she decided she didn't know the laws of the Torah. So Chaval, I guess it insinuates that they didn't keep the Torah in Moab.
She didn't, I
So-
guess she didn't know the intricacies. And there's a whole question about whether or not she was Megayer when they married, when Elimelech's sons married her. There's a whole debate everywhere. One says, no, they were not Megayer, they were not converted. Another opinion says, of course they were Megayer. Elimelech and his sons, they were great people. There's no way they would have married them were they not Megayer. But there's the question that until that point, nobody even knew that that this prohibition applied, only to men. So whatever they certainly saw them carrying out halachos and doing things, and that's really what inspired Naomi. But now she was actually being Megayer either again and taking it on again. Now Naomi was teaching her all of the intricacies. I don't know. It's a good question. They left Vayusham. They were entrenched in the Moabite culture. That's clearly the Megillah tells us Vayusham. The pasuk says they went to Moab and they were entrenched there for years, for 10 years. And that's part of the issue, is that they became part of that culture. They had no interest in going back, except the Ami did, clearly.
Thank you very much. Beautiful lecture. Amazing.
Okay, everybody, have a wonderful Yontif, wonderful Shavuos, good week, and beautiful, beautiful organization here. My goodness, really amazing.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. It was really so insightful, and it's such a message that we all have to understand the level that people could be at. We're not expected to be like Russ, but just a little bit every day to kind of emulate that is what we should all strive for. So thank you for instilling that in us all.